In 1938, anti-Semitism was ramped up, as was the quest for war. Any Jewish person returning from outside Germany was sent to a concentration camp. In 1938, asocial Jews were to be arrested. The goal, to drive Jewish people out. Jewish people arrested were to be released if they could prove they were emigrating. On the 1st of January 1939, a new law was passed that forced all Jewish people to add Sarah or Israel to their names if their names were not already Jewish. On the 12th of March 1938, German troops entered Austria and annexed it into the now Greater German Reich, in what is called the Anschluss, to little international protest, and instituted all the measures taken against German Jews over the period of 5 years overnight. There was a mass brutalization of the Austrian Jewish population, with vandalisms, assaults, etc. The state harassment of Jewish people was increased with greater restrictions, random summons to police stations, random searches for no reasons aside from being Jewish. Klemperer's house was randomly searched for weapons and was arrested for having his old saber from the First World War and had to spend some time in prison before being released. Hitler then set his designs on Czechoslovakia, an area never controlled by Germany, and the large minority of ethnic Germans in the Sudeten region who were claiming mistreatment at the hand of the Czechoslovak government. Hitler thought he could use this to start the war that he was looking for, but instead the Allies gave him the Sudeten region at the Munich conference. The national community grew to include more Germans and more people who were to be excluded, while garnering more support for Hitler amongst the German population, through these foreign policy successes. But Hitler believed he missed his chance for war. In late summer of 1939, the Polish government announced that it would be cancelling the citizenship of Polish Jews abroad, which would have left 14,000 of these people stranded in Germany. Hitler moved first with this news and deported these Polish Jewish persons to the Polish border, where they were denied entry by the Poles. These Polish Jews had to wait in between the two borders until the Polish side relented and they allowed people in who could guarantee a residence. Amongst these Poles was the relatives of a 17-year-old Polish Jewish student in Paris, Herschel Gernspan, who, upon hearing the news of their situation, on the 7th of November 1938, assassinated the German diplomat Ernst von Rath in Paris. Goebbels saw this as an opportunity to outline this as an attack of world Jewry against the German people. On the 9th of November 1938, the day of the failed coup attempt in 1923, a sacred day for the Nazis, von Rath died, and Hitler and Goebbels used this opportunity to organize a massive, coordinated assault on Jewish people and property across the Reich, now including Czechoslovakia and Austria. The goal of arresting as many Jewish men as possible and destroying Jewish property. The SA and SS were mobilized for this operation in all localities to burn synagogues, smash houses and windows in the pogrom that would become commonly known as Kristallnacht. Samuel Honecker, an American consul in Stuttgart, describes the events in a letter to the American embassy in Berlin. Quote, "Wholesale arrests were the culmination of a day of suffering on the part of the Jews. The desecration and burning of synagogues started before daylight and should have proved a warning signal of what was to come during the course of the next few hours. At 10:30 a.m., about 25 leaders of the Jewish community were arrested by a joint squad of policemen and plainclothes men. As the victims passed from the building to the motor cars, bystanders cursed and shouted at them. While this city was the scene of many anti-Semitic demonstrations during the course of the day, similar events were taking place all over Württemberg and Baden. Jews were attacked here and there." Honecker's account provides the view of a non-German for the events of the pogrom, someone who has not been present for 5 years of anti-Semitic measures, which they describe as, quote, "that which would seem unreal to one living in an enlightened country during the 20th century if one had not actually been a witness of their dreadful experiences." End quote. There were between 1,000 to 2,000 deaths, around 300 suicides, 30,000 Jewish men were arrested, and around 50 million marks of damage and insurance alone. To pay for this damage and for the death of von Rath, the Nazis imposed a 1 billion mark fine on the Jewish population to be paid through massive taxation, Aryanization, and seizing any insurance claims from damages. The laws imposed locally, such as bans of Jewish people at cinemas or libraries, were imposed Reich-wide. Jewish people were stripped of their rights as tenants, and forced labor was imposed on Jewish people. There was international disgust at this, but domestically there was little unrest. Most of the outcry came from disturbance to order and violence. The Nazis have made it clear that Jewish people are not welcome in the Reich and are actively trying to remove them. Here is an incomplete map of the burned synagogues from the November pogrom, highlighting the mass damage caused to property alone, and how it occurred pretty much everywhere in German-occupied areas. The concentration camp system, starting with Dachau in 1933, expanded across the Reich territories as more people were branded as excluded from the national community, with asocials being sent there and people like Jehovah's Witnesses as well. From the beginning, the SS guards brutalized the inmates of the camps for any imagined or real infringement of the camp rules. As the definitions of who was to be outside of the national community broadened, so too did the concentration camp system to house these people. As laws became harsher and the Gestapo pushed more people, such as pushing homosexuals in camps to give up their alleged lovers, expanded the population in the camp system around the Reich. In 1936 and 1937, Himmler, head of the concentration camp system, centralized the camps into 4 across Germany: Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, and Lichtenberg, the last a camp for women. The political prisoners who learnt their lesson were slowly released from the camps, and the burden of housing political prisoners shifted from the SS and the SA to the state through normal state prisons. This was done primarily because the role and natures of the camps was about to change. While the camps still held political prisoners, the main aim would be to hold the undesirable elements of the German population, those deemed unfit to live in the national community, and the camps would again expand across the Reich. As the historian Richard Evans outlines, quote, "concentration camps were now dumping grounds for the racially degenerate," end quote. This included criminals, asocials, deviants, people like homosexuals, or beggars. With the November pogrom, Jewish people were arrested and sent to camps for the first time for the sole reason of being Jewish. Up until this point, there may have been overlaps, such as Jewish communists or homosexuals, but they were arrested for other reasons, not their Jewishness. The population of Buchenwald doubled from 1,000 to 20,000. With the influx of these Jewish prisoners, the violence in the camps increased as well, present from the beginning, with more violent beatings occurring than previously. An old man was beaten to death for asking to use the bathroom during roll call. The death toll at Dachau between 1933 and 1936 was fluctuating between 21 to 41 people per year. In September 1938, 12 prisoners died. After the Jewish prisoners arrived, the number of deaths increased to 115 in November and 173 in December. The camps removed the undesired population from the community and set them aside for removal, which at the time for Jewish people was primarily emigration. The preferred method of removing Jewish people from the Nazi national community during this period was driving the Jewish population to emigrate, making them feel unwelcomed in Germany. From 1933, Jewish people were fleeing Germany to wherever they could. Most went to neighboring European countries that would eventually come under Nazi control, but some managed to get away to the US, UK, and Palestine, for example. Most countries had strict immigration laws, which made it very difficult for the average Jewish person to emigrate out of the country. For example, only 2,000 Jewish people at most were allowed entry into Canada from Austria and Germany before the Second World War in total. Many people who were outside of Germany were denied re-entry because they fell into a category deemed unacceptable to the new national community. One route of escape was to go to Shanghai, where 17,000 Jewish people escaped to by 1939. Others found refuge in the Caribbean or any place they could. In 1933, 37,000 Jewish people fled Germany. The numbers of the following years were smaller, in the 20,000s on average, up until 1938. All the while, countries were tightening their immigration laws and declaring themselves swamped by refugees. Many found it difficult to leave, as Germany was their home. They were proud Germans who fought in the First World War for their fatherland. Many stayed because they had Aryan spouses, but mostly the old and poor stayed because they couldn't get out or saw little prospects in leaving. There was a scramble for Jewish people to get out of the country after the November pogrom, with one estimate putting 115,000 Jewish people fleeing the Reich between the pogrom and the start of the war. One such movement was the Kindertransport, or the Children's Transport, that saw 10,000 Jewish children leave their families for refuge in the UK, to go to the UK. The goal of removing Jewish people was driven by the stab-in-the-back myth, that the Jews and Bolsheviks stabbed the German army in the back by signing the Treaty of Versailles, even though the German army allegedly never lost, despite the reality that it fell to pieces in the field. With war on the horizon, removing the Jewish population would remove the possibility of another stab in the back and guarantee the national community a chance at victory. In the winter of 1938 to 39, another opportunity to cleanse, in Nazi terms, the national community presented itself. A father wrote to Hitler that they wished to have their deformed baby killed. Hitler took this opportunity to have children who were, quote, unworthy of living, killed. He set up his personal physician, Karl Brandt, and the head of his personal staff, Philipp Bühler, as the heads of this new program. Any legal actions against this would be thrown out by Hitler. The program took place under the Reich Committee for the Scientific Registration of Serious Hereditary and Congenitally Based Illness. This was kept secret as they believed that the public would generally be opposed to this, but they managed to recruit a staff of doctors and nurses to carry out the program without issue. All midwives and medical personnel were to report any child with deformities. After looking at the paperwork only, a group of doctors would determine if the child was to be murdered. The process of medically murdering those who did not meet Nazi standards of life worth living had been set in motion and could be expanded to other vulnerable groups who have been excluded from the national community. By 1939, Jewish people and others pushed out of the national community had little to no legal protections and were at the hands of the Nazi state. On the 30th of January 1939, Hitler stepped up his anti-Semitic rhetoric in a speech given in the Reichstag, outlining that, quote, "Today I will once more be a prophet. If the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once again into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevizing of the earth, and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe." End quote. The language towards the Jewish population has increased in severity as they are now being threatened with annihilation, and from the Nazi perspective, it is not Hitler or the Nazis who are starting this new war. It is the apparent international global Jewish Bolshevist conspiracy against Germany. Hitler, being denied the war that he was looking for, kept pushing, and in March 1939 occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia, annexing some directly to the Reich, establishing Slovakia as a puppet state, and giving some territory to Hungary. In May, Hitler entered into the Pact of Steel with Italy, signing a military alliance between the two fascist states. In August, despite Hitler's anti-Bolshevist message, Hitler entered the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union that effectively split Eastern Europe between a Nazi and Soviet sphere of influence and secured Hitler's eastern flank for war in the West. Hitler is now openly pushing for war with Poland, stressing the similar apparent mistreatment of the German minority there and reacquiring Danzig, which was lost in World War I. Hitler believes that the national community is ready for war thanks to its rearmament and the Aryanization of the economy and the removal of Jewish people from the community, preventing a second stab in the back, all of which Hitler believes will allow him to lead the national community on a series of successful conquests to secure its alleged rightful living space. So that's the lecture. Here's the bibliography if anyone is interested in reading more on the sources that I used. So I hope you enjoyed it, got something out of it. I look forward to reading and marking the papers for the people who are in my group. Yeah, thanks.